The minor prophets have become a test for me in what I'm absolutely willing to stay in for some unforeseeable reason as long as 6 weeks. Thank you, Alan Wiley. And yet there's reason for us to stay in these texts for 6 weeks. I'd like to say a word first, because I like to do that, to tell you a little bit of what I know of the 4 prophets we're hearing from today. We only got to read from 2 of them because honestly, the psychology of the people in this room would be seriously questioned if we listened to all 4. We were listening, we heard from Amos first, right? We heard from Hosea and Micah. They are the earliest of the literary prophets. They're speaking during the reign mostly of Jeroboam II, a time of prosperity and a time of peace, but a time in which the society is structured to make sure that the people who have no resources in the economy don't get any resources in the economy, and the wealthy and powerful retain all their wealth and power. And the prophets begin to speak out in no uncertain terms that this is extremely displeasing to God. And they strike out at both temple cult that placates the status quo as if it's okay with God, and the society that keeps ordering itself in this way. And they foresee a destruction of pretty much everything that is coming, because largely God no longer is interested in protecting it, because it isn't worthy of being protected. And we've wrestled with what it means to have lives caught in what can't be defended, which is to say the system needed to be torn down. Systems still need to be torn down. We had those prophecies, right? That's what we did in the last 2 weeks. We talked about the struggle to fidelity. We talked about the struggle of economics. We talked about being caught in Amos's ambiguous trap, where the energy we wanted to point out our neighbor's sins then got turned on us. There was then 60 to 70 years of relative silence amongst the literary prophets. We skipped Isaiah because we're doing minor prophets. It's almost impossible for me to skip Isaiah because he's incredibly formative for the theological world that we are now in. But Isaiah, the primary prophet of that era, spoke. And it's possible Isaiah spoke with such authority and so comprehensively that there was nothing left to be written for the era that they were living in. But we have come now 60 years later to 620-ish, and we're in a new era. We're in an era in which it has become clear, not even just to trained eyes, but to anyone's eyes, that the Assyrian Empire, the world power that dominates Israel's life, is going to fall. And in that displacement of a world power, new world orders will come about. We also know that in those 60 years, the Assyrian Empire also rose, troubled Israel, conquered Israel, did everything but destroy the temple. So they've been living survival. And I'd like to do this, and I do this regularly, but I think that we need to be reminded of this to understand where Israel sits on the geopolitical stage, because it's so very different than our own placement. Did you hear the text about Egypt, for whom waters is a rampart and a wall that protects Egypt from its potential enemies? It has a geographic advantage, one that we share in, we who have fought almost no wars on our soil that were not of our own making, because there are oceans between us and everyone else. And we tend to be taught world history in a way that is so Western civilization focused. What we forget is that there's a lot going on in the East and there's a lot going on in the South. And unfortunately, if you drew lines of trade connections that want to happen, the pin in the middle of it all is Israel. A relatively barren strip of land that finds itself at the crossroads of East and West and North and South. And so every world power wants their land, not for their land's value, but for what their land lets them get to. And I think that's important because you have to understand that when they triumph over the fall of a world power, it isn't a moment of freedom. It's just now we don't know what's coming next. So they're triumphing over the fall of Assyria, both with the vexation of a people who knows that what's coming won't be any better for them, but also with the people who have very real grievances of what have happened in the last 60 years that is laid on top of an ancestral memory of thousands of years. And if you think this story doesn't still preach, you're not paying attention. And so this Sunday, the sermon title could have been Dancing on the Graves of My Enemies. Because that is a primary thread of Joel and Nahum and Obadiah and Zephaniah. This sense of, I'm glad to announce that you're getting what's coming to you. If you watch the sermon teaser, I began it talking about the golden rule. Right? That we all know, whether we even know where it comes from, or whether we even draw upon it from a Christian tradition, we know that the golden rule is do unto others as they did to you. Why are you laughing? Isn't that the rule that we would think would be golden? Who among us doesn't want divine permission to take it out on the people who've taken it out on us? Who among us doesn't desperately yearn for the divine word to say, I'm here to punish every slight that has ever been done to you? That's the rule we want to hear. Jesus and his do unto others as you want them to do unto you, I mean, like send that guy to the cross. So there's a part of the minor prophets when they're dancing on the graves, when Obadiah and Zephaniah and Joel, and I told you I was going to tell you something about them, but I've decided if you want to know that, come find me later. We have less details about their lives than we do any of the other minor prophets. But they all are speaking in this time period from a place of what I will call retributional justice. You see, there's two primary ways we want justice in the world. There's retributional justice, where vengeance is mine, and the people who have been unjust pay for their crimes and get what's coming to them. And we raise the ground beneath their feet. And we call it justice. And then there's restorational justice, which that Jesus guy seemed to be all about. The do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The turn the other cheek. The walk another mile, the you're about to deny me and betray me, but this is my body broken for you because love is the only offering I have for you. This is what we are primarily called to. So maybe we're excited to hear the minor prophets say something else. Or maybe we're deeply offended to hear the minor prophets say something else. It turns out that you have something like 3,000 years of articulation of your relationship between God and you, a relationship that has some communication challenges. There's a lot to be said, and not all of it will be consistent. And I will tell you, I struggle mightily with how to listen to this word and what to do with it. Take that, put it over here. Eight days ago, I attended, as part of an interfaith peaceful presence, the protest that happened in the tent protest erected by our neighbors experiencing homelessness. Word had gotten out that a group here in Idaho was going to counter-protest, and some of the rhetoric on that group's Facebook included a call to bring weapons and clear it out. So I responded with some other interfaith clergy to try to be there, to be a presence of peace, to keep it being a shouting at each other rather than fighting each other physically. But other groups came as well, and if you've seen my reflection on Facebook, at the end of the day, it was a disturbing event, to say the least, because the people on both sides of the street, and State Street was used as a buffer to keep them set aside, not State Street, but whatever, Jefferson. I'm geographically challenged. That's why I tell you about Israel, because I don't understand Boise. Was a street. I called the street that ran through it. But the people on the left seem every bit as angry and mocking and hurtful as the people on the right. And it went back and forth tenuously with whether it would stay peaceful or not. But the people who were largely controlling the conversation were not the people experiencing homelessness. It was a protest co-opted by a bunch of other people deeply upset with the way the world is going. A few days later, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who works in housing for homelessness, and she broke down in tears and said, "Andrew, we lost. It's too late for Boise now. It's too late. Everyone said we wanted to correct the housing problem and we could end homelessness because we were ahead of the curve, but we're not. And nobody wants to make the sacrifices necessary to change that, and we're not going to be able to fix this. We lost. We were too slow, or we were too unwilling to actually change." Yesterday, in the midst of a Presbyterian meeting, which are usually uplifting and wonderful, and sitting with Barbara Reinerson, I got contacted by a person from one of our local universities, asking me, saying I had done some research and I know that you have spoken in advocacy on LGBTQ issues, and I'm curious if you would speak to me about how you reconcile that with your work in a church. And I immediately went to, this feels like a trap. But it wasn't. The questions were genuine, and the dialogue will be good. But I want you to share these vignettes because I don't understand Nahum. And I don't much feel the challenge of Zephaniah or the plight of Joel. Because the structures of this world are meant to help me succeed at every turn. I am powerful, educated, wealthy. I have you. And so it's so easy for me to look at people yelling across the street and say, this dialogue isn't helping anything. Nahum would look at me and say, the more peaceful dialogue you're asking me to have hasn't helped us either. Not for 2,000 years. So it's very easy for you to critique the language with which I'm expressing my generational oppression. I intentionally included the Obadiah. I couldn't read it all in its entirety because when I was reading the Obadiah, and let me speak specifically to his case for a moment. We have no ability to date Obadiah. We know because of reference to the temple that it's after 587. It's after the destruction of the temple by Babylon. But it's calling to events that happened in the midst of it. They are calling out Edom, who we regularly hear of as an enemy, but is kind of an enemy in the way that your brother or sister was an enemy. Did a 6th grade report once called The Enemy. It was literally about my relationship with my youngest sister. And only somewhat tongue-in-cheek. So we typically think of Edom as an enemy, but in Obadiah, Edom is being called out because Edom is the brother nation to Israel, to Jacob. And if anybody should have been ready to protect the life of Israel, Edom should have been. And I flipped to a moment about 6 years ago in which I walked through the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. through an exhibit that was called "And Some Were Neighbors." And it recounted good and bad, the stories of neighbors to the Jews, but the one I can never get out of my head was written by a child talking about what it was like to hear her best friend rooting around in the apartment for the toys she wanted to take as they got hauled off to a concentration camp. You should not have joined in the looting of Israel. You should not have been a bystander to our plight. You should not have taken the refugees of the invasion of Israel and the destruction of Jerusalem and turned them back over to the oppressor. The call of Obadiah reminds us that God's ethic is universal, and God's ethic means that there is no such thing as innocent bystander. I don't need to understand or like the rhetoric of Nahum or of Joel or of Zephaniah or of Obadiah, but I sure better listen to it. I sure better listen to the cries of a people who aren't just lamenting a singular system designed to oppress them or to deny their human dignity, but a people who are lamenting that every system has done just that. And that if we're going to say, "Oh Lord, have mercy on us," it had better be followed by the word all. "O Lord, have mercy on us all."